Hi everyone, I think this may have begun. Can people hear me? Hi everyone, I think this may have begun. Can people hear me? Hi everyone, I think this may have begun. Can people hear me? Hi everyone, I think this may have begun. People hear me? It's working? Okay. I'm just getting some feedback from the technical side of things. It should be up in 1 minute. It's working? Okay. I'm just getting some feedback from the technical side. One second. Thanks everyone for your patience. We're just working to resolve this real quick. As soon as I get the go-ahead, I'll be happy to start. Okay, amazing everyone. Let me just open this up. I am, as you can see, pretty bad with technology. So I apologize for all the delays and thanks so much for your patience. So what we're going to be talking about today is something quite similar to what I've been talking about at many various different GCM summits. You might have been, for those of you who have been at a Global Changemakers event, you might be aware of this, but for those of you who are new, don't worry whatsoever. There's no background knowledge needed. Today, the subject that's going to concern us today is the subject of complexity and accountability. Now, you probably see those words as these huge, enormous, abstract nouns, but we're going to try and simplify them as much as possible. And my hope is that by the end of today's session, you can leave with a good sense of what kind of tools relating to complexity might be useful to you in your activism and social entrepreneurship. So what are the goals of what we're going to be talking about today? The most important thing that we're going to be talking about today is how we can think more critically about reality and how we can think more clearly about everything that surrounds us, whether that be the issues that we're working on, whether that be the organizations that we're trying to set up or trying to work within, or whether that be ourselves. You know, how do we position ourselves within the messy world of campaigning and activism and social change? And the purpose of today is to come to grips with that reality a little bit better and to come up with some kind of experiments and tools that might help us navigate these things. The point of critical thinking is to enable us to ask better questions to get better answers. It's not to allow us to become more cynical about the world. So I hope that even though there's going to be a lot of content today over the next 45 minutes, that you bear with me and that we can clarify everything at the end, okay? Now, complexity, it seems like quite a broad topic to start with, but it's something that all of us encounter on a daily basis. You know, life is very, very complicated, and it's about navigating almost impossibly difficult things. You know, it's about trying to find well-being and good health on a very short time on this planet. And that means that always we're encountering contradictions and difficulties relating to lots of different things. So many of us have listed just a few questions on the screen, but many of us might have difficulties relating to our relationships or our work or making enough money or balancing our own ideas of our own aspirations with other people's expectations of us. And all these things are completely normal. The purpose of complexity thinking and critical thinking is to meet these complex questions with answers that are as sophisticated as the questions that we're posed all the time. Now, the purpose of critical thinking is to try to understand, almost clean our reality filter, and to realize that if we're confused, if we're thinking that a problem is very, very complex, well, we're probably in the right place. That means if we're lost, it means that we're probably in the right track to finding ourselves. So I hope that as we approach lots of different topics of complexity, you can all remember that the main purpose, you might see it in option 4, is that we want to be as sophisticated as the systems we're trying to change. We want to be as complex in our thinking as the complexity that meets us in daily life, okay? So I hope that that's something that we can achieve today. So before we begin this journey through complexity, I want to start with a little story. And like most Hollywood stories, it's a story about old white men. And so this story begins with the story of the Enlightenment and many of the great scientists of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And these are the thinkers that have laid down pretty much the main paradigm today, which is almost the paradigm of simplicity, is what I'd call it. Now, this paradigm, these thinkers that began to emerge in the Renaissance, particularly in Europe, they really, really believed that their own intellect could take them very, very far. And they assumed quite a lot of things about the world around us. Reality was controllable, it was predictable, and it was simplifiable. We could separate reality into different categories, and where we could very neatly make an accurate picture of what was going on in the world. And so the goal of all academics and the goal of politicians was to determine reason, determine what the one truth was by thinking about it, by discussing it and debating it, and that we can make very, very clear, rational decisions. And through this paradigm of simplicity, by simplifying the world, by understanding the world, we could manipulate the world, we could control its laws and create the most rational decisions possible. Now, this might seem like, oh, quite a bold statement, but this paradigm, this way of thinking about the world, the idea that we could control and simplify the world is incredibly, incredibly powerful and lies at the basis of many of the ways that we think across the world today, whether that be business or whether that be academia. This paradigm of simplicity that these scientists really, really pioneered, but then has come to dominate global thinking today, has a few key principles. One of them is uniformity, that there is one truth, not multiple truths, but one truth, and there's one way of reaching it, primarily through the scientific method or through the use of reason. The purpose of knowledge is to control. The more knowledge we have, the more power we have to control society, control our relationship to nature, and dominate reality around us. Separation. If the world is simple, and if we can increasingly understand it, we can clearly separate it into categories that we can make sense of. And finally, the final two ideas is one called determinism, the idea that there is a very clear relationship in the world between things and their consequences. If I do A, then B neatly follows. So if the world is so simplifiable and controllable, then we can do a few very concrete things, setting up an organization, choosing this policy, introducing this law, and that will lead to clear, observable, and reproducible impacts. And the key, almost metaphor that these scientists began to use, which dominates much of our thinking today, was the idea of the machine. The world was a machine, a very, very simple and usable and manipulable machine. Now, the idea of the world as a machine, it might seem a bit distant today, but it's actually a kind of a metaphor that is at the root of so many of the ways that we think about the world. We talk about driving change as if the world was a machine that we could drive. And similarly, a lot of the scientists of the Enlightenment began to honestly see the world as a machine. They began to divide the human body into the different components, and they began to study the world as a machine of parts. And the whole purpose of science was to understand the different parts, understand what had to be done to different parts to fix them or to solve them or to heal them. So people began to think of the entirety of the universe, just as much as influenced also by the Industrial Revolution, where machines began to gain a new dominance in the economy. People begin to understand, look at the world and see it as a machine. Now, this fragmentation of the world, the ability to put everything into categories, the way of understanding the universe through the prism of a machine, translates very, very directly to the educational system. If you think about what schools look like, the whole model of the modern school was based upon industrial factories. School is a series almost of assembly lines. You go through different grades, and there's quality control at the end, right? The modern school was thought up as a way to industrialize education, to make it into a much more formal and rigid and mechanical process. And if you think about when we go into the schooling system, what we understand is that very, very quickly, reality is cut up in a particular way. We fragment the world into different separate categories, and we divide everything into key subjects, right? We follow particular routes if we go into university education, and the world is very, very neatly cut up, as if these things belonged in very, very separate categories. Now, this whole kind of impulse of classifying, of separating, translates to pretty much all domains of science and thinking. Most clearest example can be in the way that we think about the animal kingdom, in a very, very clear set of classifications for each particular being on the planet. And this impulse to separate led to the imposition of very, very clear separations and what people call dualisms, clear distinctions between things. There was a clear distinction between men in one category and women in one category, between human beings and what was non-human, between what was modern and between what was traditional and had to be left behind. A very clear distinction had to be made between what was animate and what was inanimate, between good and bad, normal and abnormal, between what was pure and impure. And through this very, very sheer belief in the power of knowledge, in the power of human beings to submit the world to their own intellect, and the ability of human beings to rationally make decisions, this pretty much way of thinking is still with us today across our governments, across our institutions, across the dominant worldview of most people. But increasingly, the sciences and the humanities and communities around the world are saying, well, this worldview is actually quite flawed and has actually led to many of the problems that we're seeing today. The world is not only more complex than we think, but more complex than we can think. And this impulse to simplify and separate the world has done a lot more harm than good. Now, complexity science and complexity theory begins in this origin. It begins with questioning this kind of legacy of the Enlightenment, this arrogance of being able to make very, very clear answers to any questions. And the key reason that the world is so complex is because the world is full of relationships. Nothing is separate, but everything is connected. And all of us, as an individual human being, or as a society, or as a country, these are entities that are unbelievably complex because they're constantly interacting with other things that are shaping them. We are not separate. We are not classifiable. All of us are exceedingly unique and constantly affected by relationships. So the fact that all of us are influenced all the time by so many different factors, by different people, means that we have kind of irreducible complexity. And across every subject, these kind of nuances are beginning to emerge. So these nuances are telling us something very, very different. We don't have one truth, but we have multiple truths. Reality is plural, it's dynamic, it's uncertain. We can't be very sure about things. And the goal, instead of finding the one answer or the one truth, is to understand that we have to find and acknowledge that there are multiple truths, that we have to find solutions that respond to many people's different idea of what reality is. And instead of finding one method, we have to use lots of different methods that do justice to the diversity of the world. So this whole move of a worldview from simplicity to complexity means a variety of transitions. It means stopping to see things as separate and moving to see things as connected, to look from one truth to many viewpoints, from reducing our glance to looking at things in isolation to being a bit more holistic and seeing the connections between things. Now, across the sciences, across many disciplines, this is already happening. These transformations from analysis to synthesis, from looking at parts to looking at wholes, from looking at things in a linear way to looking at things in a circular way, are already happening. Take, for example, in biology. The legacy of simplicity made us to see everything as a separate species, right? That it exists by itself, that we can classify very clearly. But increasingly, people are seeing, well, no species is separate. Every organism is dependent on others. And every being in the world is dependent on ecosystems, it's dependent on lots of other beings to allow itself to live. So for example, plants in botany are not being seen so much anymore as individual plants with a particular species, but as holobionts, as a community of different beings that work together to allow a plant life to emerge. We're increasingly noticing that many of our assumptions about the simplicity of different species in the world are incredibly wrong. There are deep complexity, irreducible complexity in every single being. And everything is much more alive and difficult than we might have thought about before. So I put in one headline there, but the more we learn about the world of nature, the more we realize how little we know, and the more in awe we are of the immense difficulties of understanding systems that are so connected. If we think about genetics and going back to the idea of binaries, one of the big debates in psychology and the world of social science was the debate about human behavior. What causes human beings to be the way they are? Is it their nature? Or is it their nurture? Is it one of these two things? Increasingly, the answers of complexity is that it's always both and it's always complicated. The science of epigenetics is telling us a story about how nurture affects our nature, how instead of this separate relationship between either nature or nurture, we have things that are interacting constantly, which reduce from us the ability to say very clearly, no, this is a case of nature, this is a case of nurture. Well, the binary simply doesn't hold. It's both, and it's both working in complex ways. In evolution, increasingly, instead of one story about how human beings behave, that human beings are driven by purely rational behavior, by competitive behavior, that there's simply a huge survival of the fittest, increasingly evolutionary scientists are seeing, well, there's actually a whole dizzying range of behaviors and logics that impel human behavior. So instead of one simple story that the world is this hyper-competitive place where animals kind of muscle each other out, well, actually we're having a much more complex conversation about, well, there's actually lots of different dynamics. There's dynamics of cooperation and competition and love and affection and care and dismissal. So the stories, all simple stories, basically end up as hollow. In climatology, people used to believe that we could, for example, very easily map human weather. Not human weather, sorry, but weather in general. But as you all know, there's nothing more kind of unpredictable than the weather. And increasingly, instead of attaining possible certainty, climate scientists are talking about irreducible imprecision. It's impossible to fully account in models for the complexity of the world. And as we gain more knowledge, that does not mean we gain more answers. We actually gain more questions. As you can see in the graph on the right, increasingly global climate models, as they account for different things, become much more complex and much more uncertain. So in fact, the illusion of control, the illusion of deep and holistic knowledge about everything is impossible. We simply lack the tools to understand everything. These insights also translate into the world of management, urbanism, and design. If you think about traditional management theory, it is rooted in the science of certainty. If the manager does X, then Y will happen. If we design this amazing, amazing consumer product, then this is the impact. But increasingly, instead of these blueprint models, these incredibly vertical models of how solutions are implemented, we're realizing there's often a very, very big gulf between design and how different people use it. And people use products in very, very different ways. So increasingly, the science of human-centered design is gaining a stronghold as we realize, oh my goodness, things are a bit more complex than the blueprints might suggest. All these conversations are also very much seen in conversations about gender, sexuality, and race. Previous old assumptions about biological determinism, that there was a very particular way of being a woman, a very particular way of being a man, have been significantly challenged by research into the whole fluidity of gendered behaviors and the relationship between societal expectations and the behaviors of people of different sexes. Similarly, the previous understanding of race, which was based on this idea of if we could classify animals, we could also classify human beings based upon certain observable characteristics. Well, lots of critical theorists and the science of genetics has shown, well, the concept of race is entirely nonsense. There is no such objective grounding based upon observable features. And in fact, the whole category of race reflects something that's much more complex. And human beings share basically the majority of their genetic data. So that has basically eliminated this impulse to classify and clarify the world through racialized theories. Similarly as well in the science of economics, this idea that the human world is simple and we can rationalize it and we can simply graph it is also gained a lot of criticism. We are not rational actors, but we are boundedly rational people. We have certain rationality sometimes, but we're obviously constantly exposed to our emotions. And as awareness of the ecological crisis has grown, we have come to move away from a very, very simple vision of economics that simply sees very clear associations. Economic growth is prosperity. More money equals more happiness. These associations are increasingly challenged as people understand that there are many, many ways to think about the economy, and the economy can't be separated from other crises like the crisis of health or issues relating to gender inequality or issues relating to climate change. And also the idea that we can simply predict how the economies are going to function is also losing a lot of hold. We're increasingly gaining humility as we realize the limitations of our intuition and our ability to model and predict the future. A famous example of this was pre the World Cup this summer. The bank UBS ran 10,000 simulations using very sophisticated models that suggested Germany was going to win the World Cup. Well, as most of you know, Germany was eliminated in the first round. And economic predictions, especially when they assume that they can be very simple, are constantly being challenged for a lack of almost humility when it comes to the complexity of reality. Similarly, in medicine, the traditional approach of medicine of reducing everything to an individual patient, of making sure that there were single solutions to single bodies, is also gaining a lot of criticism as we realize more and more that all medical problems are complex problems because they relate to society, they relate to our visions of health, they relate to many more factors than someone's individual choices. And so increasingly doctors are coming up with more systemic and complex views of health. Similarly, in neuroscience, the previous understanding of the brain as this kind of machine with different compartments, one compartment for memory, one compartment for creativity, is also getting a lot of criticism. Brain imaging is increasingly showing that the different sections of the brain are inherently connected and deeply complex, and all parts of the brain work in synergies to do all kinds of features simultaneously. Now, this might be frustrating. We have this impulse to want to know how everything works, and we want things to be like a simple machine, like a car. But unfortunately, or fortunately, human brains are not cars. They're not little toys. They're deeply, deeply beautiful and complex and intricate organisms at work. Similarly in physics, increasingly in physics, our ability to understand the mechanics of the universe is being challenged by the fact that the mechanics of the universe are deeply complicated and almost unobservable. The reach of the universe lies beyond the human capacity to understand it and the human capacity to create tools to understand it. So we're left with these big black boxes in our understanding of the physical reality around us. And so scientists are increasingly saying, well, the new model of science is not one where we discover things, we make very clear claims at things, but as Michela Massimi says, it's about being able to carve out the space of what might be possible in nature, not about what is happening in nature, but what is possible. So it's a position of science that's rooted in a much more humble stance. And also we're realizing much more that the vision of science, that science can give us clear one-dimensional answers to problems, like what do we do about this healthcare challenge, or is this technology safe? Well, increasingly, scientists are moving from a normal perspective of science to post-normal science, where facts are uncertain, values are disputed, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent. And in these situations, whether it be, what do we do about the future of climate change? How do we accept and incorporate AI into societies? There's no one answer to these challenges. They are multidimensional challenges, and unless we have a complex approach when we deal with them, well, we're going to fall flat in our faces. And simultaneously, in the humanities, I'm sorry that this is such a big kind of rapid journey across all these very difficult topics, but in the humanities as well, I mean, pretty much all, you can summarize pretty much most papers in the humanities with a very simple explanation. Things are more complicated than they meet the naked eye. Every single paper in the humanities is about uncovering the rich kind of density of things that are happening beneath the surface. So in a way, the iceberg model is very, very useful. When we look at reality, we see something very simple. We see something that's only on the surface. But increasingly, if we look below the surface and we look at all the connections that make something complex, we realize, oh my goodness, we are always looking at a reality which is complex, which is changing, which needs a more sophisticated pair of glasses. So for example, one good way of thinking about this is when people think about the economy, or we think about a topic like the economy, people usually think about what they read in the news, which is things about growth or macroeconomics, or what's happening inside companies that give people wages, or what's happening inside big corporations. But as the iceberg model shows, that's only one small section of the economy. If the economy, we use it to represent something much broader than what we do in our schools, on the street, in our families, between friends, in community associations, in non-capitalist firms, what we do under the table, in our relationships with the people we know, that also counts as the economy. And if we apply the iceberg model to everything, you realize that every human being is basically an iceberg. We have what we see on the surface, but the more you get to know anyone, you realize, oh my goodness, there's this rich density and complexity beneath anyone. Now, the more we understand about complexity, we realize that our one-dimensional way of thinking about causality changes drastically. The linear way of thinking is that A causes B. But if B affects A, and C affects A, and D affects A, well, that means that our whole vision of how A causes B is a bit more complicated. How do we talk about causes when causes are consequences? If we want to trace the story of how we got to a particular conflict, where do we begin? Where do we draw the line? Now, for a lot of people, this is very frustrating. This removes from us the ability to say very simply, well, why do we have crime in our city? Well, the simple explanation is, there's violent people, and if we eradicate the violent people, A causes B, then we will have no more crime. Or if we, for example, increase sentencing or have the death penalty, that will automatically cause a reduction in crime in a linear way. But we know from observing reality that these things are complicated. The same policy in one town will not work in the same way in another town because there's lots of connections and lots of factors that are affecting it. We're going to go into this a bit more later on. I will give you an example about how this relates to me in my daily work. I work particularly on the issue of climate change. Now, with climate change, for example, when you apply a complexity view, you realize that the impacts of climate change are not determined simply by the severity of the weather. It's mixed with all the social factors that are in an area. So if you take a hurricane, or if you take a flash flood, or if you take a wildfire, you realize that these wildfires, their impact will depend not just on the severity of that wildfire, but on all the things that something needs. This explains, for example, if you look at earthquakes, why does an earthquake with the same magnitude kill 100,000 people in Haiti, for example, but kill 200 people with the same magnitude in Chile? There's lots of different social factors there that have to be included if you want to understand why climate change works in this way. Which, to me, the conclusion there is, if you're concerned about climate change, well, you have to be concerned about lots of other things. You have to be concerned about social inequality, and about urban planning, and about gender, and about race inequality. But that's a clear example of how simplistic thinking, I think, leaves people very short-sighted, at least when it comes to climate change. But you take any issue, and it's very, very similar. And finally, the sciences of complexity have increasingly told us that, well, authority shouldn't just lie in the small group of Enlightenment experts in academia. When we talk about the fact that there's multiple ways of telling the truth, multiple ways of understanding reality, we realize that people have power and legitimacy. It's not just about what's published in academia. It's not just what's published in a scientific paper. It's not just what happens in the lab. But people across the world have an experience of reality which is valuable. And there's non-traditional and marginalized knowledges that we need to start considering in our picture of the world if we want to gain a clear understanding of reality. Now, all of you might be saying, look, this is very confusing. I do not even understand what you're saying. So I'm going to try and root this a bit more in something that's quite common to us activists. As activists, we have a temptation to kind of see problems in the world and immediately reach for solutions and understand how can we get involved in crafting those solutions. Now, this is an incredibly useful way of thinking. We should all be inspired to be doing that. But as I said, we need to be as sophisticated as the systems we're trying to change. And we need to understand that when we look at problems that are happening, whether it be poverty, whether it be about menstrual health, whether it be about inequality, we're looking at wicked problems. Wicked problems in that they're problems with lots of different roots that are hard to unpick, that are very, very hard to solve. There's no one solution, and you need lots of different approaches from lots of perspectives in every unique context to approach it. So once you accept that something's a wicked problem, you need to start dealing with understanding that wicked problem in a much more complex way. Now, one thing that we often rely on to understand how a problem is, how bad a problem is, or how something is changing, or if we're making progress with our solutions, is we rely on statistics and on methods to understand how something is happening. So for example, if we're concerned about hunger in the world, and we want to ask ourselves the question, okay, how many people are hungry in the world? Because we want to see if we introduce this policy, is that going to make people less hungry in the world? And what's our diagnosis of the problems we face? Now, the FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, estimate that for 2015, the amount of hungry people in the world was around 780 million. So that's a pretty dire situation, but then we can estimate, well, what happens if we implement this, and how does that change? Now, if you go look at a little bit more depth into that definition, you'll see, oh wait, how did they come up to this very, very rounded number? And what definition of hunger did they use to come up to that level of gravity? Well, you realize that their definition of hunger is basically a state lasting for at least 1 year, where a person has an inability to acquire enough food, defined as level of food intakes insufficient to meet dietary energy requirements. Basically, translate into human English, that's like when someone basically eats less than 1,800 calories per day, and that's for a whole entire year. They have to be basically hungry for a full year period. Now, if we look at this definition, we already see, there's a few problems here. There's a few assumptions. What if we see that someone who's hungry could eat enough calories but be deficient in nutrients? Or the majority of the poor people in the world, are they living sedentary lifestyles? Or are they working, for example, agrarian lifestyles, which require far more calories? What if someone's hungry for 11 months in the year, but makes enough food in 1 month to be able to satisfy their dietary needs? They would be excluded from this definition. So the assumptions in this study show us that actually the picture of reality is a bit more complicated. The situation might be a bit more worse. The same with statistics like the poverty lines that are very, very quickly used to show us that, well, here's how bad the situation is, or here's how things are improving. If you look at the World Bank estimate for extreme poverty, it's around 900 million people, or 12.8% of the global population. And increasingly, these statistics have been used by lots of organizations and lots of anti-poverty campaigners to tell us the good news story. That, we've really, really successfully over the last 30 years reduced poverty to very, very low levels, and that's based upon particularly neoliberal economic policies that we've been implementing, and through particular aid donations. But well, what if we look at the methodology of how the statistics where the statistics originates? It originates in the poverty line. To calculate poverty, the World Bank uses a poverty line that used to be around $1.10, now it's around $1.90. And they estimate that as universally, underneath that threshold, you can't meet your basic needs. And by basic needs, we're talking about education, healthcare, food, shelter, water, clean water. Now, think about your own hometown. Would you be able to meet all your basic needs as a human being with $1.90 a day? Well, the reality is that it's an incredibly low threshold. And by keeping that threshold so low, we can tell a very, very happy and positive story about poverty, which excludes a kind of more critical understanding of how the global system is currently failing people in poverty. If we use a much more ethical line, which is closer to what people need to survive and meet all their basic needs in a dignified way, if we use, for example, an ethical poverty line that's close to $5 a day, well, suddenly the statistics change. 4.2 billion people, the vast majority of the global population, lives in poverty. That's more than 4 times what the World Bank estimated, and it shows a situation that's much more dire. And crucially to complexity thinking, it shows us that our current methods are not working. In fact, I think the situation is getting worse. We've had 1 billion people added to the ranks of the poor in the last 35 years. So once again here, using complexity thinking, looking at how studies are done, looking at how statistics originate is crucial for understanding what kind of reality are we looking at, how bad are the problems, and what kind of solutions do we want to use. And it's super, super important to always be aware of how things are being measured. It's very easy to be swept away with a particular statistic, but in the reality, people understand the reality in different ways. What use to us is a statistic about economic growth if people in personal interviews say that their life is getting much worse with higher levels of economic growth. And this is a great cartoon that I think illustrates that. So with all these different, when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which of course is the high priority of a lot of international institutions, when you hear countries talk about their success in meeting those goals, it's always important to understand, okay, how are those goals being calibrated and what methods are being used to calculate the reality and how things are working. Because once we look at, for example, see poverty not just as something that's based upon a line, a particular numerical threshold, and say, well, actually poverty is about something much broader even just than shelter. It's about linking to our right to leisure and participation and affection and protection, as the wonderful economist Manfred Max Neef has explored. Well, we realize then that a simple numerical digit doesn't suffice to explain the complex reality of poverty. So I think this is very, very important if you want to adopt complexity thinking, that whenever you're looking at anything, always see it as a useful contribution, but as a humble approach to the very complex nature of reality. Every study is a product of its assumptions. All models will flow from their methodologies, and those methodologies will always be limited. All data that you see will be defined by the way it's collected, and all algorithms and equations flow from their internal expectations and structures. Even the most obvious models, the ones that seem most intuitive and make sense to us, for example, can be challenged. Take, for example, the easiest, most probably the most accessible equation in the world, which is the equation of speed, right? So, for example, how fast does a car go? That equation of speed is distance over time. Now, if you think, for example, compare the speed of a bicycle and a car, and a human being walking. Now, obviously, someone would look at a car and say, look, no, the car is much faster. It can go 80 kilometers over an hour. Because you're calculating how, in a very small way, how that car is traveling over a particular period of time. But for example, other economists, when they calculate all the time that someone has to put in to pay enough money to buy a car, to pay for car insurance, to pay for gasoline, to pay for all the different things that need to make a car run, compared to all the different time input that we have to put in to make a bike run, well, you realize that the speed of a car decreases significantly because the denominator, which is time, increases, right? So in fact, even the equation for speed is complicated. If we include more variables, more complexities, then even simplistic things like what's faster, a car or a bicycle, become a bit more difficult to state. I'm going to skip very rapidly through this, but complexity thinking and attentiveness to critical thinking also means that we have to be very attentive to the language and the buzzwords, which unfortunately are very common in the world of activism. There's a great cartoon which shows exactly that. Often when we're talking about politics, it's very hard to be talking about things in a clear way. And when we use words like empowerment or equality or justice, these are very, very difficult terms that mean very different things to very different people. And so we have to just be very careful and attentive to what we see. We have to also be careful when we're looking at what governments or NGOs are putting out. Often you'll see very, very clear use of wording to try and deflect attention from reality. Here are just some examples of how the words we use reflect the understanding of the world we have. When we talk about the poor, we can also say it in a different way, people who are actively impoverished. When we talk about, for example, government services being externalized, well, that's just another way often of saying privatized. And the examples are constant. We have to be very, very clear with trying to speak about the world in the clearest possible way and not use lots of language to deflect things. Because at the end of the day, the language that we use reflects our understanding of the world as it is. Take, for example, probably one of the most common phrasings in the development sector, which is the idea of developed and undeveloped. This very, very clear category to distinguish between the poor countries in the world and the rich countries in the world. But even the idea of developed or undeveloped assumes quite a lot of things. For example, it assumes that development means that it's a process of advancing to a superior level. It assumes almost that poverty is this endogenous thing that has only happened inside countries, nothing to do with their relationships with other countries. And there's a firm understanding that development isn't this plural thing, it's this one kind of trajectory, and people are either developed or they're not. Development needs to look the same everywhere. But also it kind of doesn't really do justice to the history. When people talk about India as an undeveloped country and Sweden as a developed country, well, has that been the case historically? And what does history look like? Indeed, when we look at history, we look at actually countries have changed their positions in the economy quite radically. And in fact, what we consider to be some of the most undeveloped countries today are actually countries that were among the most developed 200, 300 years ago. So the category for undeveloped might be more accurately called something like undeveloped on purpose by the developed countries who used a lot of that wealth to become developed themselves. But once again, the category of first world, third world, developed, and undeveloped often clouds our judgment and clouds our picture of the world more than we'd like to admit. So for example, when we talk about developing countries, the reason we need those clear categories and to be a bit more careful about what we use is because if we don't realize that, we start to assume that, well, the only reason that countries are poor is because they haven't implemented the right policies and because they haven't received enough aid. And if only we gave them more aid, if only we just pumped more assistance aid from the UK to Rwanda, then things would be much better. But in fact, if we look more carefully at statistics, we might even see that actually the problem is actually there's a hemorrhage of money from developing countries. In fact, more money leaves those countries, particularly through tax avoidance and through trade misinvoicing, than actually arrives into the form of aid. So in fact, the question arises, is it aid that those countries need, or is it more just policies around trade and around tax? In any ways, the purpose here is not to come to some definitive conclusion, but to open up the questions and to start scrutinizing these categories and these labels that often we hear in development discourse. And this comes to solutions. Like I was saying before, when we think in a linear way, we begin to make very simplistic associations between problems. So we begin to say, oh, the problem of insecurity or of crime is purely linked to an absence of police. If only we had more police or more people with weapons, there would be less crime. If only we had stronger sentences, then people would be less inclined to commit crime. If only we prohibited drugs, and people would stop consuming drugs. And these associations are very, very deeply rooted within us. It happens from everything from a global perspective, but also to a personal perspective. You might be facing a personal challenge, and you might think, oh, if only I take this medication, or if only I signed up to this class, or if only I'd had this job, then all my problems would be solved. Simplistic problem solving is rooted in us, but we have to always work to try and challenge that. And always work to understand that intentions in the world don't necessarily become implications. By embracing complexity, you embrace the fact that our powers are limited. When you perform an act, that is always going to be connected with lots of other things that are happening in the world. And so you have to be attentive to what you're doing. There is no one-fit-size model for everything. And in the world of activism and social entrepreneurship, so often we feel that our good intentions will necessarily translate into better realities. But in fact, that often not is the case. There's lots of well-intentioned projects that have failed miserably and had very counterproductive impacts. Now, the problem there wasn't the intention. The problem was the understanding of how that project would unravel. So complexity thinking encourages us to stop thinking so much about solutions and non-solutions. Solutions depend on what is understood as a positive project and how that project is implemented. How is it received by a local community? How are those people working on it or participating in the implementation of that project? And the question becomes much more complex. So once again, we have to start avoiding the boundaries of good and bad, sustainable or unsustainable. No social project is perfect. If we were interested in perfection, we'd have to go into the world of the gods. But we're interested in activism and social entrepreneurship, which means dealing with the messiness of human beings and the messiness of power relations. We know, for example, that I'll give an example of why I'm thinking about impacts and intentions is very important. Going back to my experience as a climate campaigner, a lot of people say, for example, that an incredibly important thing to do to reduce our energy use and reduce emissions is to introduce lots of energy-saving technology, right? So, for example, the LED light bulbs, I'm sure a lot of you might have heard about it. Now, LED light bulbs is a great idea, but say, for example, you're a business owner and you implement lots of LED light bulbs and you save a lot of energy. And so as a result, you've saved $5,000 in your business. That's really, really good news. But what happens if you use that $5,000 to buy yourself a trip to somewhere really far away, nice and warm, where you can go on a holiday? Well, the overall impact in terms of emissions is much higher. You saved a lot of energy and a lot of emissions through LED light bulbs, but then you use that money to do something else. It's a rebound effect, what people call in climate science. But these feedbacks are constantly existing. A very, very well-intentioned aid program might give money to people that is used in a way that counteracts that very, very process. So we have to be constantly aware to how things are implemented, the process to the way things are done, and to how people are understanding every project or every initiative that we're working on. A great example is this. Microfinance, for example, is one of the most lauded solutions in the development space. Now, microfinance is not good or bad. It's a technique. And implemented in the right way, it can be incredibly empowering. But implemented in the wrong way, it can leave people burdened with huge amounts of debt. And it often misconstrues what actually people need in that environment. Often, for example, in lots of microfinance cases, there's not enough demand among an impoverished community to supply someone who's trying to set up their own local business. But the simplistic narrative of if only we gave people a small loan, that's all they need to really advance out of poverty, simplifies the situation of poverty in lots of cases. That's not to say that all microfinance is bad, but whenever we see an idea like a microfinance project or a renewable energy project, these things may have great intentions, and often when implemented well with a good process, they can be really, really good. But if we abandon complexity thinking, then things can often bite us back later on. So this brings me to one of our last topics, which is organizations and projects. The inheritance of simplistic thinking And a lack of appreciation of complexity feeds down into the way that we understand how we build organizations and how we run projects. Just like you can implement solutions in a particular way, many of us have understandings of organizations that are highly simplistic. And often when we try and do something, we try and think of a simple way. How do I really want to work on a project working on menstrual health in my community, and very quickly realize, oh, this is difficult, or I don't have enough funding, or these challenges begin to emerge. And my encouragement from this kind of webinar is to embrace the complexity. It is absolutely fine to be confused. And that's exactly a sign that you're on the right track, is if you're acknowledging contradictions and tensions as opposed to trying to eliminate them and eradicate them. So when you see a situation of injustice, before you set up a project, or before you understand, okay, here's what we need to do, let's rush to a solution, it's important to acknowledge what Mariam Kaba, for example, who's a phenomenal criminal justice reform, transformative activist in the States, thinks about, which is what resources exist so I can better educate myself about this problem, who's already doing work around this injustice, do I have the capacity to offer concrete support, and how can I be constructive? And once this process begins, you just have to start asking questions, which is, okay, what's going on with this problem? Who's working on it? How are they approaching it? And what if we did other things? What if we set up an organization to do this? And we're asking questions along the way and realizing what are other people doing things, acknowledging that complex landscape of social change. That means also trying to think about, okay, in any system, if we realize that every issue is systemic, so the reason why in my community there's lots of children who drop out of school really early, you have to understand, okay, what is causing that? What are the different factors that are causing it? Not one cause, but multiple things. And what are the ways that we can look for to change that? Are there any mindsets or goals or incentives that we can try and modify? Are there any protagonists that we need to speak to? And the current system and the way it works, what holds it up? How do we identify the key tactical ways to change that? And that means listening to everyone. Often going back to the idea of what is who is worth speaking to, or who has the right answers. We often tend to kind of idealize things that come from the World Bank or from what seemingly highly authoritative sources. But wisdom and knowledge of how systems work is universal. Everyone has an experience of reality, and everyone can contribute. Robert Chambers, who's a great theorist of development, has a great example where he spoke about a situation in Eritrea where consultants came into a local village and said, asked, what would be a great land policy for this village? And these were consultants working with the government, so people kind of, apart from being fearful about political repression, but also immediately said, what the government says is right. I trust you guys. You guys know. Now, a simplistic approach would have said, great, we did the participatory feedback. The community says, great, what we think is the best. Let's go ahead. But then these consultants decided to do something much more participatory. They sat down with people. They started drinking tea. They started having social conversations. It wasn't something highly planned or bureaucratic. And immediately the conclusion became, well, oh my goodness, these people have a huge understanding of their current land policy. Here's all the constructive suggestions they have, and here's how they understand land and their environment. So even complexity thinking also tells us that in our organizations or in our approaches, sometimes the best advice isn't necessarily coming from people like me leading a webinar, or people with seemingly authoritative stances on things, or experts in the academy. These people have useful contributions, but everyone does. And it's important to be quite inclusive in the way we understand authority. And similarly, it's very, very crucial that in the way we run our organizations, we reject the mechanical approach to things. The scheme of the machine that I talked about earlier that runs throughout schools, that runs through the way that we organize our educational system is identical pretty much to the ways that we organize social projects. If you go into any social project or NGO or social enterprise, usually you will have mechanical organizations that are separate. Everyone does a particular role. And there's very simplistic ways of thinking. There's clear quotas and strategies and performance targets. A causes B, and there's a very vertical and hierarchical way of doing things, which is based upon almost a car factory. If we have someone who's supervising, someone who's managing, someone who's doing, that's the most effective way to do things. Well, complexity theory increasingly tells us, well, this is just one way of running an organization, and it's not the only way. That doesn't mean that like doing a performance target is bad, but it means that when we start creating an organization, let's try, to not replicate the kind of dead weight of the organizational thinking of the last 300 years, which is often highly exploitative, but let's try and come up with new ideas. And there's lots of ways to run an organization, not just one simple template. Once again, when we talk about organizational culture, many of us are in parts of lots of organizations, it's crucial to think about, okay, how are we doing these things? How is everyone feeling? How inclusive are we being? Who are we including in this organizations? Who is visible in this organizations? Whose voice is heard? And the iceberg model helps a lot. If you look at an NGO and think about how it works, or any social project, you might read these very glossy brochures that tell us about the policies and the goals and the objectives and the accomplishments. But if you look underneath the surface, often there's lots of unwritten things and unwritten exploitations in that organization, or unwritten rules in that organization that are causing it to not be very good. So I encourage you to take critical thinking, not just from the realm of academia, but into your own organizations and into your own lives as well. The legacy of simplistic thinking means that we have lots of associations and kind of biases in our head that lead to very, very bad outcomes. I've listed a few that you can return to, but these are just some of them. Often organizations will try to be highly mechanical. We'll try and think that if only we did things in a reasoned way, and if we do things in a very structured and tight way, then everything will run smoothly. Well, that can be the case sometimes, but it's not the case always. And people are people. They're not machines. They're not robots. They're people with emotions. They're people with different norms and different ideas that have to all be included. So I encourage you to think critically and creatively about complexity in your organizations. And that means, following again the work of people like Chambers, that we have to see organizations not as separate from societal problems, but as part of them. Just as we ourselves are not separate from society, and our work is our work and the personal is personal, the personal is political. We are affected by society and we affect society. Organizations are very much part of society. And even if we're fighting against gender inequality, or fighting against racialized violence outside of the workplace, we can very much have those legacies inside the workplace. So I encourage you increasingly to move away from a simplistic way of understanding how we run things in organizations, but more sophisticated, complex, and human way of doing so. I'm going to skip this here. And I want to return to the most important subject, which is ourselves. Now, a lot of us, struggle for certainty in our lives. We struggle, we want to have meaning, we want to have very clear answers, and we want to be motivated. And that's totally understandable. We need to be able to dance the game of being motivated and finding inspiration in stories and following our passions and following simple answers, but also at the same time being scrutinizing, realizing that even though sometimes the universe screams at us saying, that the world might seem so complex and we're just a tiny little dot, but the things that we do matter. But we need to realize that we're not separate to reality. We are in the mess, and things are messy for us, and things are messy in our organizations, and they're messy for our issues. So the principles of care and justice and transformation that we desire for the outer world have to be our aspirations for our inner world. We are also, when we talk about activism and campaigning and changing the world, have to be also accountable to the fact that that means also changing our own internal world. It means changing our own biases. It means working on trying to improve ourselves and trying to bring things to the world to make ourselves not only make the world a better place through our own behavior, but also make things lighter for us as human beings. It means understanding that, we do not have the truth with a capital T as one person. All of us are affected by so many different factors that shape the way that we think. These are just some categories which are limited, but all these different things affect how we think and affect the insights that we have, but also the blind spots and the things that we don't see. So if you look at your organization and you realize, oh my goodness, we have excluded many people who represent different points of view about society, or you realize that, your window into reality is quite limited. And a lot of organizations suffer from the problem of having a problem with a monoculture of thinking, where it's only a very certain kind of people are in that organization, and they think in a very, very limited way, mainly because of the absence of diversity in that organization. So in a way, one of the quickest routes to having a more sophisticated conversation is just having more diverse conversations with people from different backgrounds, and encouraging those conversations, going away from an organizational strategy of certainty and of authority towards one of humility, one of care, and one of finding equal spaces for people to contribute. It means realizing that behind every human being that we work with, that we encounter, is a deep, deep, deep undercurrent of lots of different things. In our organizations, one of the biggest things that I think holds us back is the fact that we don't talk in human ways about things. We don't realize where people are coming from. We don't realize what people value or how to value people. And we want, as activists, we want people to be machines. We want people to just do exactly what we want to tell them and to follow clear theories of change. Well, I always love this iceberg model because it shows that, human beings are just as complex as the systems they're part of, and are just as complex as the problems that they're participating in. So do as much as you can to self-scrutinize yourself, but don't obsess around that all the time either. We need to be a balance of doing things, making mistakes, learning, doing things, making mistakes, learning, thinking about theory, thinking about how we do things, and then experimenting with understanding as well. So to conclude, some principles that you want to put into your toolbox on your route to being more complex campaigners and social entrepreneurs is accountability. Try and root your views in the views of perspectives of people who are at the front line of different issues. If you want to understand the severity of climate change, it's not that great speaking to someone who's in the ivory tower of some prestigious university. Speak to people who are at the forefront of the climate crisis. If you want to understand what it's like to live under the most violent implications of economic poverty or of patriarchal violence, you have to root your views in the people that are most at the forefront of those things. There isn't any perfection, so get rid of the idea of there being a perfect solution organization and work towards a better process. Remember that you have unique gifts that you can contribute, as does everyone else. So have a healthier hope that is more resilient towards the difficulties and complexities of the world, but we know that things are always possible. Prioritize well-being, but always try and scrutinize things and be flexible with your ideas and your ideals. And finally, don't complex complexity, chase it constantly. Always try and work on joining the dots between the different issues that you see. Think about the system as something that you can work on, not one that you can work in or out of. Remember that the world and human beings are flowers and not machines. They are things that have to be nurtured. They are not machines that have to be controlled and driven. Everything we're doing in life is attempting. It's not about achieving things. We know that changes are always very fragile. Just because we achieve something one day, it could be eradicated in a few years' time. So instead of seeking meaning in clear achievements, try seeing everything as attempts that are noble and important and often have great impacts, but not as things that are stable over time. Question the status quo and remember that all the limits of the possible are there to be moved, and do your best to be a learner in the world as well as a contributor. Remember that we're here at the end of the day to try and make things a better place for ourselves and for the people around us. So move away from the temptations as much as possible of prestige and power. And remember that the struggle is one for justice and one for well-being and lightness, not one for accolades necessarily, even though those sometimes are important. So finally, don't associate critical thinking with criticism. It's constructive criticism. Don't accusate our humility with paralysis. Just because we're limited, just because we're human, doesn't mean we're unable to do things. There's lots of things we can do. And don't reduce complexity to something that we can only do with the mind. Emotional intelligence and corporal intelligence is just as important. And I hope that this leaves you with, I think, the final message. The purpose of thinking about complexity is to understand that instead of changing the world, we need to understand that all we can do is really strive to participate meaningfully in the complex web of life. And I hope that in your activism and campaigning and everything that you do for the rest of your lives, you can appreciate that humility and work to be as sophisticated as the problems that we're trying to change. So yeah, I'm sorry that was very, very rapid and very, very quick. I've left a few more resources here, which I'm happy for you guys to read. I really encourage you. There's some great resources there, and I'd be happy if you email me to talk about, share any other more specific resources. But for now, do any of you have any questions that you want to bring to the table? Any final questions? You can post in the YouTube chat if you have any questions. Oh my goodness, it's so meta. If you look at there's like an infinite webinar going on. Okay. Hey, David, how are you doing? So yeah, no, I think that's absolutely the way to go. Multidimensional poverty measures are really, really important. And once again, I think that's where everyone's moving towards, is increasingly multidimensional measures of everything. The important thing, as always, is to look critically about what dimensions are being included and which ones are being excluded. But I think the purpose of critical thinking is to accept that everything is limited and that everything's a contribution. It's not to simply do away with everything because it's limited and say, this is problematic, so we can't use it. There's everything that's problematic, but there's different levels of problematic. And even though we can never identify one specific causal link, we can identify strong links. So it's what I'm saying is not to kind of completely discard any causes and be like, well, for example, the relationship between a lack of education and stronger civic action, right? There is a link between people having different access to education and information and being more civically active. That means we should work on the former, but it means just not to simplify and not to simply boast too much about our accomplishments, because lots of things feed into each other. But I think once we see a strong association between a particular style of work and particular outcome, we should all focus on that. But yeah, it's working with humility and with confidence simultaneously. Sorry, that's a really bland answer, but I hope it's useful in some way. Any other questions? Hopefully soon. Hopefully one day. Hopefully one day. Anyways, team, well, it seems like we're out of questions. I really want to thank everyone for the attention and for the time that you've spent listening. I really appreciate your patience as well with the technical issues at the beginning and with the velocity of the presentation. And I hope it wasn't too muddled. If you have any more questions, feel free to email me. I'll leave you with my details at the end. And yeah, have a great rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of the amazing webinars from other people at Global Changemakers. Keep on liking and following the material. And if you have any more questions or criticisms or suggestions or feedback, I'd be super happy to hear. But for now, big hug and thank you, everyone.